Hello and welcome to the Gospel Online. My name's Jake and I'm a member of the Sale Christadelphians in Manchester. In this video, we'll be considering the meaning of the word Satan in the Bible. Now, the word Satan is actually a very simple word when we look into it, but it's also a very misunderstood word. You see, the word Satan in our English language is a word that has changed its meaning over the years. Like many words in our dictionaries, the meaning has evolved over time. In fact, if we were to open our English Bibles and compare them to a Hebrew scroll, we would see that actually the word Satan isn't an English word at all, but a Hebrew word. In our English Bibles, the word Satan has been left untranslated and has instead been transliterated from the Hebrew alphabet into the English alphabet. And actually, if we were to find a Greek copy of the New Testament, Greek, of course, being the language that the New Testament was originally written in, we would find the same again there. The word Satan has been left untranslated and has been carried over into the Greek, transliterated from the original Hebrew. So if we're to understand this Bible word Satan, then it's important that we look up what the word means in Hebrew. So let's do just that. If we consult Strong's Hebrew lexicon, we find that the word Satan means an adversary, one who withstands or resists, or who stands against. In other words, an opponent. So we see straight away in the Bible that the word Satan is just an ordinary Hebrew word that means an adversary or an opponent. It's a description rather than a name. A Satan is simply someone or something who opposes someone else or tries to stop a person from doing something. So that sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But is the Bible talking about one particular adversary or opponent when it uses this word? Or is the word as general as our English word for adversary? In other words, does the word Satan only apply to one specific adversary, or could it be applied to anyone or anything? Well, let's look at some examples of usage of the word throughout the Bible to find out the answer. Now, you might be surprised to hear that this is actually quite a rare word in the Old Testament of the Bible. The word Satan in the Hebrew appears only 27 times in the Old Testament. 8 of those times it's translated into English as adversary or withstanding, and the other 19 times in our English Bibles it's left untranslated and simply transliterated. So let's first look at a few examples where the word has actually been translated into English. First of all, let's go to the history section of our Old Testaments and to the first book of Samuel, chapter 29. And this chapter records for us part of the life of a prominent Bible character called David and some of his interactions that he had with the Philistine people. So reading from verse 3, then the princes of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the princes of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days or these years? And to this day I have found no fault in him, since he defected to me." But the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, "Make this fellow return, that he may go back to the place which you have appointed for him, and do not let him go down with us to the battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. But with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? So in this passage, David, along with his men, defect and form an alliance with one of the commanders of the Philistine army. Well, this causes a bit of an uproar with the other commanders, as they were concerned that David, who in time past had been their enemy, would then turn against them in the battle. He would become their opponent or their adversary, as that passage describes it. And that word adversary there in verse 4 is the word that we've been talking about. And if we consult the original Hebrew text, we can see that it's been translated from the Hebrew word Satan. So here we see David, an ordinary human being, is described as a Satan. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Being described as a Satan doesn't necessarily mean that someone is a bad person. In fact, elsewhere in the Bible, David is described as being a great and a very faithful man. In fact, he's called a man after God's own heart. However, on this occasion, he was a Satan, or an adversary, or an opponent to the Philistines. So let's look at another example then, just to confirm to ourselves whether the word is used in this way consistently. So slightly further on in the Bible record then, we read some words about David's son, Solomon. And the passage that I'm interested in looking at is in the first book of Kings and chapter 11. So reading verse 14 of that chapter. Now the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was a descendant of the king in Edom. So again, we read this word adversary or Satan, and again it's applied to a person here. In this case, a man called Hadad becomes an adversary or Satan to Solomon. And in fact, if we were to read on in this chapter, we would see that Solomon acquired quite a lot of these opponents, described in the Hebrew as Satans, because he turned away from God. In verse 23 of the same chapter, for instance, God raised up another adversary against him, Rezon, the son of Eliadar, who had fled from his lord, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. And then verse 25, he was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, besides the trouble that Hadad caused, and he abhorred Israel and reigned over Syria. So not only were these men adversaries to just Solomon, but they were also adversaries to the whole nation of Israel at that time. Now, we could look at more and more examples of people in the Old Testament being described as Satans in this same way. And I'd encourage you to examine these examples for yourself. But it isn't just people who are given this description of a Satan. In the book of Numbers, we have an account of a man called Balaam, who was a prophet, someone the Bible describes as being a wicked man, someone who didn't follow God. He disobeyed God in choosing to travel to the king of the nation of Moab to curse the people of Israel. Let's just pick up the account in chapter 22 and verse 20. And God came to Balaam at night and said to him, if the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do. So Balaam rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. Then God's anger was aroused because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. So here in that passage, we see how Balaam sets out on his journey, and his way is blocked. And in fact, we'd see his way is blocked multiple times, in fact, by an angel of God. And this angel of God here is described as a Satan, or as an adversary against this man, Balaam. Balaam sets out on a journey in opposition to God, and the angel physically stands in his way. He blocks the path as an adversary, or as a Satan, as it is in the Hebrew. So the angel here is actually a good Satan, because the angel was doing God's will and stopping Balaam from doing wrong. The angel was stopping or opposing evil. And so the angel was a Satan against Balaam, a Satan against evil, not a Satan against God. Now, we could go to multiple other passages, but let's just look at one more example of the word Satan in the Old Testament. And this time, let's look at an example where the word is actually left untranslated. Again, in the history section of our Old Testament, and in the first book of Chronicles this time, we read another account about the life of David. Now, Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. This is in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 1. So, in this record, we read how an adversary, a Satan, moves David to carry out this count of the number of men in Israel of fighting age and ability. But who is this Satan? Was it perhaps a great enemy of Israel who caused this to happen? Or was it a devious person who tricks David into doing this thing? Or was it even a good Satan, like in our last example, someone in opposition to the nation of Israel, but who was making them do the right thing? Well, the Bible actually answers this for us, because if we go over to the parallel account in the second book of Samuel, in chapter 24, we have the same description of events. And if you read through both chapters, it's very clear that these are both accounts of the same events, but there's a very interesting difference. The word Satan has been replaced. Just reading verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 24. Again, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, "Go, number Israel and Judah." So, by putting those passages side by side that we've just read, we see that in this case, it was actually God himself who was this Satan against Israel, which might be surprising. But remember, Satan just means adversary, someone who is against someone else. So God and Satan can be and are the same in these passages. The only God of the Bible is a Satan, an adversary to Israel on this occasion. He was against them at this time because they had disobeyed him, and therefore he was angry with them. So even God himself can be described as a Satan in certain situations. So we see this is an ordinary word. It can be applied to anyone. Now, we could keep going to more and more passages in the Old Testament and keep seeing the same thing, but I think the picture is already clear. The word Satan is simply a Hebrew adjective. It describes anyone or anything who acts as an adversary or opponent against someone else, regardless of their intent. We can have a good Satan or a bad Satan. It's just an ordinary descriptive Hebrew word. And I think looking at the word in this way just helps illuminate for us some more difficult to understand passages, such as the book of Job, for example, where we read about a Satan who acts in opposition to this man called Job. We can see by applying what we've learnt in the rest of the Old Testament that there's nothing to suggest that this Satan in the book of Job is a supernatural being of evil or anything like that. This is simply an opponent who acted as an adversary to Job. So that's the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Well, as we've mentioned already, in the New Testament original Greek, the word Satan has been left untranslated and has been carried over, transliterated from the original Hebrew. The Greek way of saying this word is Satanas. So, in that case, we can expect to find the same definition of the word as in the Old Testament. Let's look at just a couple of examples to see if this is the case. Firstly, let's look at the Gospel of Matthew and chapter 16, where Jesus predicts his death and his resurrection. Picking up in verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are an offence to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. So here the disciple Peter is described as being a Satan by Jesus. This isn't because Peter was evil, but simply because he was trying to stop Jesus going to Jerusalem to suffer and die. Peter wasn't a bad person. In fact, he was a good disciple. He was a faithful follower of Christ. He had good intentions and he had nothing but love for Jesus. But here, on this occasion, he was a Satan because he was opposing God's will. He was trying to stop Jesus dying as a sacrifice. His reasoning and human thinking could have stopped Jesus from carrying out the most important part of God's plan. And so Jesus says, stop getting in my way when I'm trying to do what God has asked me to do. Get behind me. So Peter here was a Satan because he opposed Jesus when he didn't understand that Jesus' death and resurrection were an essential part of God's plan. So again, we see that a Satan is simply an adversary, someone who is in opposition to someone else. It's exactly the same in the Greek as it is in the Hebrew, that although in the Greek New Testament it's only used in the negative sense of the word, there aren't any good Satans in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the word is specifically used for someone or something that opposes the gospel in a negative way. And we can apply this understanding to other New Testament passages. For example, when we read these words in the first letter of Thessalonians, therefore we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us. When we read those words in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 18, we can understand how it was human opposition to Paul that prevented him coming to visit the Thessalonian believers. But actually, the Bible explains that for every one of us, our own greatest adversary, our own greatest enemy, isn't any external opponent, but it is in fact our own sinful self. We are so often a Satan to ourselves. Now, how is this the case? Well, it's because we so often give into our own desires to sin that then stop us, they oppose us from following Jesus. This is why the Bible sometimes uses the word Satan to describe people's own sinful desires. For example, in the book of Acts, we read about a man called Ananias who gave in to the temptation to sin. We read, "But a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession, and he kept back part of the proceeds. His wife also, being aware of it, brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet." But Peter said, "Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself?" And that record is in Acts chapter 5. So we read about this man called Ananias, who was actually a follower of Jesus, but who made a wrong choice. He decided to lie about a donation of money that he had made to God. The verse says that Satan had filled his heart to lie. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we read the next verse, it explains what this Satan was. Verse 4, "While it remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. It is you, Ananias, who has contrived this deed in your heart," it says. Ananias' heart, his sinful desire to do the wrong thing, had acted as a Satan to him because he gave in to his temptation and he sinned against God. So the word Satan is used to represent Ananias' sinful thoughts and sinful desires that opposed the things of God. Verse 4 clearly shows that they were his own thoughts. They weren't put there by anybody or anything else. And God actually punished Ananias with death because of the severity of his sin. That's what we go on to read in this chapter. And it would have been unfair to do this if another wicked being called Satan had made him do it and he had no choice. But we know from reading the Bible that God is fair and just, and therefore Ananias himself was responsible for his own actions. The Bible is very clear that the choice to sin, the choice to disobey God, comes from the human heart. Temptation comes from within ourselves. Now, it might be triggered by something that we see or something that we hear or by a situation out of our control. But ultimately, we're tempted by our own desire to sin. God has given us free will to choose between listening to what God says and doing it, even if it's hard to do. The letter of James spells this out very clearly for us, reading from James chapter 1, verses 13 to 15. "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am tempted by God,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." So, there is no powerful evil being called Satan. Instead, Satan is just an ordinary Hebrew word that can be used to describe anyone, even us. Now, it was tempting to use lots of vivid imagery of Satan to illustrate this presentation. And I think that's why the popular image of Satan has stuck in the collective consciousness today. It is so memorable and so visually powerful, isn't it? But as we've seen, this is not a biblical idea. The Bible is clear that there is only one God who is all-powerful and who created everything, both light and darkness, and he has no rival. And there are so many passages that say this, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. But let's just look at one last passage in Isaiah chapter 45, reading verses 5 to 7. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God beside me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. We need to put to one side and ignore the misunderstood definition of Satan that is so often used in English today. You know, the source of evil, the archenemy of God, seeking the souls of men, some sort of fallen angel and tempter. Because we see from an examination of the Bible text that these ideas are not true. The Bible word Satan is simply a Hebrew adjective that describes someone or something that is an adversary or who acts in opposition to someone else. That's all there is to it. Now, if you found this video helpful, please subscribe to The Gospel Online and click the notification bell to keep learning more about the amazing message of the good news about Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God.